Here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Boom, and welcome to the Big Honker Podcast, brought to you by Ducks Unlimited. I'm Jeff Stanfield with the world-famous Andy Shaver.
Nice, cool, soggy morning. Fall is here. Hunting season has opened up, and we're living the good life now.
Inch and a half rain over the weekend, a half inch overnight.
We didn't get that much.
Yeah, we did. Roland had an inch and a half of rain since Thursday.
Okay.
So it's pretty good. Your neighbor, so you can disagree with it all you want to. But anyways, we had a good rain. It's green. It's wet. The ground's dark again. Thank you, Jesus. We needed it bad.
That's right. That's right. All right. On the line with us today from Ducks Unlimited, Dr. Mike Brasher. We got the duck numbers out. Everything looks a little bit better with some species of ducks. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, let me first just say it's great to be with y'all today. It's early September. People are out already hunting, and we're getting excited for all the good stuff that's yet to come. Favorite time of the year. Days are getting shorter. Daylight's getting shorter, and so we know what's just around the corner and already here for a lot of us. So yes, it was. I guess what was this? A couple of weeks ago? No, a week ago. Golly, it all
Week and a half, 10 days ago, something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Everything came out August 20th, and it was a bit of a surprise, I think, for some folks. And I guess if we go back, earlier this year, a lot of people were thinking that we were going to have another downturn. Thought that going into the spring, it was really, really dry on the prairies. But then we started to get some rain up there. And so I guess for people that haven't heard, things turned out better than what many people were anticipating. Duck numbers were up in the traditional survey area, 5%. That's the first time we'd seen an increase in total duck numbers since 2015. It took us a minute to kind of figure that out. Someone said, wait, when was the last time we had an increase? Could it have just been down from the record highs of like 2016, 2017? And of course, we missed 2 years there with the whole COVID thing. And so we don't know what the numbers would have been up or down then. But nevertheless, up 5% for the total ducks, and some species like mallards were also up. And so once you get into those 5% range, 3% range, up or down, that's pretty much safe just to say it's similar to last year. But I'd much rather it be on the positive side of that than the negative side. And so it was an overall really favorable report that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put out relative to what a lot of people were anticipating.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. So mallards, it's kind of everybody's favorite duck, 6.6 million. What was the high? The high, we looked at that not too long ago. The high was what, 2016 or something like that? And it topped out what?
12 million at one time.
Was that what it was, Mike?
13 million.
Yeah, something like that. I don't have the exact number, but I am looking at that at the graph, and it was right around 12 million. Probably, I think 2017 is when that would have been.
So we got half the mallards that we had in the last 7 years.
But they're rebounding.
Yeah. I think they're set up for a rebound. I wouldn't look at this year and say, oh, this is a great rebound. I think what this shows is that, okay, we've reached at least a short-term bottom, given where habitat conditions are across that broader breeding landscape. It was still last year really dry across the prairies. So the fact that we didn't dip further, remembering that this is a spring breeding population survey. These are the birds that were hatched and were already alive last year and survived through the winter. So this reflects no production this year. So knowing that it was still really dry across much of the prairies last year, and that we were, at worst able to hold steady up an 8% on sort of the numerical side of things, I mean, that's a good thing. So what we need from a rebound standpoint is multiple additional years of moisture across all of the U.S. and Canadian prairies. When you go back and look at 2011 through 2015 or so, that's what we saw during that time frame that allowed duck populations, mallard populations to climb year after year after year. That landscape was just incredibly wet across a broad geography, and when that happens, ducks will do their thing.
So I got to ask, we got the American widgeon up 55%.
Everybody get ready for the widgeon, right?
That seems like a typo. I mean, how can that be 55%? That is a huge increase for the Great American Baldpate.
Yeah, we had a little bit of discussion on this in a couple of episodes we produced here recently. That number, we do not expect any wildlife population to increase or decrease by 55% year over year on a regular basis. I think what we have to remember is that this survey, although it is the most expansive and scientifically rigorous of any wildlife survey, certainly in North America, if not the continent, it's still not perfect every year for every species of ducks. These ducks nest in broad geographies. This survey, back whenever it was designed, was really designed to do the best job at capturing and estimating population size for mallards, largely a prairie nesting species, but one that also nests in the boreal forest all the way up into Alaska. But if you look at this survey, you'll notice that the transects are densest, and there's more transects per area in a lot of those prairie strata, and as well into the parkland strata. But once you get farther up into the boreal forest, these transects are spaced farther apart. There's not as many of them. I mean, it's a massive, massive landscape. We just do not have the capacity, the resources to survey at that same density across that boreal forest as we do the prairies. And the boreal forest has variable habitat conditions from one end to the other during any given year. And so it's not unexpected, let's say, for some of these more boreal nesting species, such as the widgeon, such as green wings, such as scaup, to maybe have some of those more erratic fluctuations, which, to be honest, is probably a more artifact of some kind of sampling anomaly, as opposed to an actual 55% increase in widgeon population. That doesn't mean the survey is not useful. What it means, though, is that we have to recognize the survey for what it is and for what it's not. And if you look at widgeon over the long term, for those species where you might see more of that sampling variation show up and produce some of these dramatic shifts from year to year, you look over the long term for widgeon, and they're stable. They're doing great. And that's what we would expect for some of those species that are more closely tied to that boreal forest. There's some ups and downs in various strata from one year to the next, maybe in response to some drought conditions in parts of the boreal or parts of Alaska or wherever. Those things can get captured occasionally on some of these surveys. But, over the long term, what we're really looking at is what's the long-term trend for a species like this? And it's pretty healthy. So that's a good thing.
Do you think that will technology ever advance to the point to where we can start getting a better picture of what happens in the boreal forest? Like whenever we start looking at advancements with radio tags and everything like that, do you think that somewhere down the line we're gonna figure out what's going on inside the boreal forest?
I think we're going to be closer to doing that on the habitat side of things and how it may change from one year to the next, or from every 5 years or so, at a more comprehensive scale. Then we're closer to being able to do that for the birds. I mean, counting birds, being able to identify these ducks in that massive landscape from some remotely sensed imagery, I think we're a little bit farther off. But from a habitat standpoint, we're closer. And I know there's a lot of work going on right now to try to use some of that satellite imagery to quantify, to estimate the pond numbers and how they change from year to year and even within a year. But the other thing, I guess, is the boreal forest, again, is relatively stable from a wetland standpoint when you compare it to the prairie. So annual changes in the boreal forest we don't expect to be too great to begin with.
Right.
It remains a very difficult landscape to study birds in, difficult to count birds in. but we are certainly thankful that we have it, because we know that it provides an important safety net for a lot of ducks.
Could weather impact? Like, I'm looking at, just talking on the Widgeon, like, you know, they've got the transects that they count birds on during that time of year. Could weather play a role in that? Like the Widgeon just hadn't made it past where they are counting birds, if that makes sense. And that's how we saw this big increase, because there's just more Widgeon in that area that they're counting in.
Absolutely. And that is, to go back to last year, that's one of the things that we believe was responsible for the substantial decline in estimated duck numbers, breeding duck numbers in Alaska. That Alaska strata, a collection of Alaska strata, were down 50% in total estimated breeding ducks. We don't expect Alaska to have lost 50% of the breeding ducks in 1 year. And so we had some discussions with pilot biologists last year, and they said, yeah, the spring was late, and there were some places that were still frozen whenever we were flying the survey. Other places thawed early. And so when you're flying these transects, conducting this survey over such a massive, massive landscape, you're going to have some of that. Sometimes, some years, you're going to have weather conditions that aren't timed perfectly across the entire survey area. And pretty much every year, you're going to have some area where the survey and the weather are not ideal relative to their timing. And so, yeah, that can certainly be part of it. But the other thing is that there is variation in habitat conditions, whether it be drought or flooding, that could cause certain places in Alaska or the boreal forest to be inhospitable, and birds may go there and say, no, not hanging out in this area this year, and may go to somewhere else. So there's a little bit of both. Some of it's going to be sampling and timing of the survey, and then some of it's going to be actually what's happening on the landscape and how birds are responding to those changes, and we're picking that up in that survey. So a little bit of all of it.
So the other big winner on here was the green-winged teal, up 28%, or up 20% from last year, up 38% on the long-term average. So this winter,
another boreal
forest bird.
Yeah, another boreal forest bird, closely tied to that, but they will breed in the prairies quite a bit, and so there were some areas their number was really high in that's one of the great things about like the actual report. What we in Ducks Unlimited put out and others is just the high-level summary over the entire traditional survey area or the eastern survey area. But if you get the actual report, it breaks down the population estimates and the changes from last year and changes relative to the long-term average for individual survey strata. And they do it for each of these species. So if you look at green-winged teal, the eastern Dakotas, the breeding population estimate for green-winged teal in the eastern Dakotas this year was 300% higher than what it was last year in 2023. Now, were some of those birds counted en route to migration northward? Did all 300 or 270,000 of those breeding green-winged teal settle in eastern Dakotas? We don't really have a confident answer for that. Some of them, we do know there's probably some birds that are counted twice. Some are missed during the survey, again, just because of some of the timing and where the birds are and weather delaying certain aspects of the survey. But nevertheless, generally these trends of where the water and where the habitat conditions are good, that's where we see that's where we typically see birds respond. Greenwings were interesting in that regard, though, because if I compare that to blue wings, the blue wing breeding population estimate in the eastern Dakotas was down 16%. Green winged was up 300%. Now, still, eastern Dakotas, that was the area of the highest blue-winged teal breeding population estimate at 1.7 million. So that is also some of the information that you can get from going deep into the survey. 1.7 million blue wings in the eastern Dakotas versus 270,000 green wings in the eastern Dakotas, and that 270,000 was well above average for green wings. So a lot of things going on with different species in different locations. And so we try not to make too much of each of those fine differences at the strata scale. But nevertheless, it's fun to look at and And big, broad patterns typically seem to hold.
So what does this report look like? Like it comes across I'm sure you get it in an email form or print it out or whatever. Like how thick is this thing? How much information are you having to digest to get just this snapshot of to send out to hunters?
Yeah, so it's a report that's 65 pages in length, and there are actually, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service puts out about 6 or 7 reports and then a few additional memos on the same day. These reports come out late August, mid to late August, and they come out a week or so before most of the flyway councils have their technical meetings in the fall. Flyway Council technical committees use all of this information to inform their discussions. So this was the Waterfowl Population Status Report. That's where the results of this breeding population survey are summarized. They also released the Adaptive Harvest Management Report, which provides all the recommendations for the following year. There's a mourning dove report. There's a sandhill crane report, I believe. There's also a report on harvest and hunting activity from the prior 2 years. And the report that, of course, we focus on first when we get it is the Waterfowl Population Status Report. The information is presented. The report is formatted similarly year after year, so you know what to look for. You know where the high-level summaries are going to be. We know where to go to pull these numbers out and enter them into our templates. We've got everything already prepped and ready to go, of course, because you want to get this information out there to our members as quickly as possible. And so we've been doing this for a number of years, and we've kind of have a system. And but then the process of digesting the numbers and looking to see where these patterns across different breeding areas really may have showed up. So we'll be looking at it for a while longer.
Oh, really? Just keep diving in and looking at these fine numbers?
Yeah, we don't necessarily do a whole lot with. Well, I guess so. The initial media release goes out, so we get it in an email. Yes, from the Fish and Wildlife Service. They send it to us. They send it to all the Flyway Technical Committee members. They send it to a number of other folks. Delta Waterfowl gets it. Cal Waterfowl. All the different waterfowl organizations get it. And we put out our initial press release and our summary, and we do the media blitz around it, try to bring attention to this, giving credit to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state and provincial agencies that are the ones that do these surveys and summarize the data and produce the reports. Ducks Unlimited doesn't have a hand in that. We just want to get it out there to the people that care about it, and that's our hunters and our members. But then we're developing presentations for our leadership to present to our board of directors, to a lot of our other senior volunteers, folks like Jimbo and David Schusler and Tim Farringer. They're going to be talking about these numbers to a lot of our volunteers at the grassroots level. They're interested in this number. It's an exciting time. We're getting into the event system when that's picking up, banquet season. And so this is a topic of conversation. So we're developing talking points and sending it to those folks for them to have. We also do a waterfowl season outlook live stream thing. That I guess that was last Monday night. And then forthcoming, we're working on an article for the Ducks Unlimited magazine. So it doesn't stop for about a month after it's released.
And Jimbo was saying this is like y'all's Super Bowl. Like when this report comes, This is one of the biggest days at the Ducks Unlimited campus.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, back in the media room, we have for that day. Now, because there's some understanding of when the survey is going to come out. You know, our federal partners and state partners also need to know when this is coming out, because for this year, actually, the Mississippi Flyway Technical Committee was meeting. And they didn't have the survey. The survey didn't come out until I think the second day. I guess it was a Tuesday, August 20th. It didn't come out until like the second day of their meeting, which was less than ideal for them, but it's just the way the timing went out. And so we had some idea of the day that this report was going to be released, and we had our team of like 8 or 9 people around this big table, and we're like, when the numbers come out, when I get the email, we have several people on the email list to make sure we get it. And oh yeah, the energy is pretty high. We all get there early at around 7:30 in the morning. knowing that the report's not going to come out until late morning, early afternoon. And then we're just sitting around and we wait on it. And then when it comes in, everybody goes into motion and we pull numbers and we pull from some a series of sort of previously prepared quotes for our leadership based on a host of different scenarios. And it's an exciting time. The energy's high.
I've got a question about the mallards. The mallard population is going down. We all know that. Now y'all are saying it's starting to come up. But what's the true count, you think, of the domesticated mallards? When I say domesticated, I don't mean pet ducks, just the city ducks, because there's mallards. I don't care where you go. You can be in the far south. You can be up north. Every town has got pairs and pairs of mallards flying all over the place. And I think that's pretty safe to say.
Yeah, it is. Jeff, I don't have an answer for that. If I had time, so what these surveys do, that when you're actually on the ground or in the air counting, you define the scale at which you're going to do that sampling and that counting, and then you can extrapolate. And then the proper way to interpret it is to say within that area within which that survey is designed, we estimated that many mallards, and we can say it's relative or relevant to that area. But the survey doesn't cover urban areas. It doesn't cover a lot of other just area in general. There are states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan that conduct state surveys, but they don't estimate number of mallards in parks or urban areas. And there is some thinking that maybe that's a growing percentage of their overall mallard population. So they're kind of curious about that. There are ways, theoretically, that you can get a better estimate of a continental population, and that being something called a Lincoln-Peterson estimator. I don't know if y'all have heard about that. It's used increasingly to estimate goose populations, and it relies on two basic pieces of information and a little bit of algebra, where if you know how many birds you harvest at the continental scale, and if you know what the harvest rate is, harvest rate comes from band recovery data. Total estimated harvest comes from those harvest surveys. If you know those two pieces of information, you can do simple algebra to get at a total continental population size, because total continental population times the harvest rate would produce your harvest. So that is a method that is being used for geese, and it's being used for mallards and a few other species for which we have adequate data. But there still are some assumptions you have to make about that. And invariably, whenever you do that Lincoln-Peterson estimation method, the number it produces is substantially higher than what we see from, let's see, the survey that we're talking about today. And that's the way it should be, because this survey doesn't capture all of those areas. Jeff, I don't know, however, if it would capture all of those urban mallards. So it's still imperfect at estimating those. And I don't think anyone has a good handle on that.
It makes you wonder how many actual extra thousands and thousands of ducks we have on the mallard counts that they're saying, well, the numbers are way down, but Disney World has 1,300 mallards flying around. And because it doesn't matter where you go, you see mallards flying. The city I grew up in, Wichita Falls, they got ducks flying all over the place, and those are never counted. So
but let's be honest, we're not necessarily interested in the mallards there in Disney World, are we? Because how often do those actually go out and make themselves available to us as hunters? And the other thing that we've begun to learn from some of the work that Phil Vretsky's doing is that and a grad student up in I guess he's a doctor now. He recently graduated with his PhD from Michigan State. He captured mallards in some urban areas as well as some rural areas throughout the Great Lakes states, and then did the genetic analysis on them. And of those birds captured in those urban environments, there was a higher percentage of that game farm ancestry, game farm genetics in those birds. So genetically, they're kind of different birds. And he also demonstrated that those urban mallards did not wander out as far as some of the rural mallards. They didn't migrate as far. They didn't migrate with as much, I guess, direction or consistency. But there's some other work being done by a guy in, I think it's Indiana. It's not the University of Indiana. I forget the name of the college, but they're banding some of those urban mallards, and they are making themselves available to harvest. So it's a little bit of everything. Maybe in Disney World and some of the subdivisions, they aren't as readily available for harvest, but in other areas they are. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Do you think that there will ever be a time where that population is saturated so much into the wild mallard that, things just don't migrate as far as they used to? And could that be part of what we're seeing right now?
Well, I hope not. I hope it never gets to that point. I think there are some folks that would say that may be partially what's responsible for some of what we've observed with regard to changing distributions of mallards in some geographies. And I helped out with a recent study conducted by a postdoc at University of Missouri and a colleague with USGS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where we looked at changes in the harvest distribution based on band recoveries of mallards that we partitioned into different subpopulations. One was sort of a Great Lakes population in southern Ontario, and then we had two subpopulations as we labeled them, one corresponding to prairie Canada and the western boreal forest, and then the other corresponding to the U.S. prairies. And then we looked to see if their harvest distribution, sort of the mean, we looked at a number of different metrics, but has the harvest distribution of those birds changed over the past 60 years? And we did find some changes. Not the most dramatic change was for those birds in the Great Lakes. Those are the birds that have the highest percentage of game farm genes. Those are the birds for which the recent study said there is a relationship between probability of migrating and length of migration and the extent of game farm genes in those birds. Is that cause and effect? Don't really know. It's strongly suggestive that may be part of what's going on with regard to migration of birds from that geography, but we didn't see the same thing with birds out of the prairies. And I think the evidence is going to show, I don't know how much we have right now, that the genetics of prairie mallards is still largely of the wild type. And so there's some potential stories to be explored there from a scientific perspective. And that's, I think those are the type of questions that people can look forward to, hopefully being answered in the coming years. But it definitely makes for interesting conversation.
Yeah, I mean, and especially as we dive further into the work that Dr. Lavretsky's doing, with his genetic testing and everything, like we're going to be able to get an accurate snapshot of, well, how much game farm bird does this mallard that we're shooting now, how much was just domesticated? And, everybody, especially in Louisiana and kind of that Arkansas niche, that little area, everybody's always complaining about the ducks not getting there anymore. Well, maybe the game bird has just overtaken it. And I mean, because that's what, if you look at a wild animal, all they care about is surviving year to year and reproducing their genes. And if they don't have to go all the way down into Louisiana or Arkansas, and they can stay in Chicago, St. Louis, that area, well, they're going to do it. I mean, it just makes sense for them from a longevity standpoint.
Yeah, the thing that makes it complicated, Andy, is that, the thing that makes the discussion difficult is that the natural world is complicated. We all want, and me included, want to know what is the single factor that's responsible for causing what it is that we're observing and that has affected us in our hunting and number of birds that we're seeing. The reality is there will never be a single factor responsible for all of what we see. Could be partly genetics in some locations for some species. It's going to be partly habitat conditions, landscape conditions. It's going to be partly weather conditions from year to year and over the long term. It's going to be changes in agricultural practices, whether we're talking about the expansion of agriculture into some landscapes or new agricultural practices, post-harvest practices, or planting practices that are going to influence the attractiveness of a given landscape to birds. And I've mentioned this to someone before, it's not just how attractive your property or your landscape is to ducks, even relative to how attractive it used to be. It's how attractive and appealing is it to the other places where ducks have an opportunity to go. They're under no obligation to come back to your place or your duck hole or anything of that nature. like you said, their objective is to survive and reproduce and feed, and they're going to look at all of the options they have available to them in figuring out how best and where best to do that.
Yeah, I don't think that there's a smoking gun. I don't think we'll ever be able to pinpoint this is the reason, but it would be interesting to know if, this is a factor, and to what degree. Well, that's up for debate.
Yeah. Well, I will also tell you that the other part of that study that I mentioned, the lead researcher has already produced 2 publications out of that. I'm actually working on a magazine article right now. It's going to be out, I think, in the November-December issue of the Ducks Unlimited magazine, where I'll highlight some of the results from the first 2 parts of that. The third part of that project is trying to do exactly what you talk about, Andy, identifying which factors may be responsible for some of those changes. And so what we're doing is looking at how band recovery in a given location has changed over 60 years, and then also looking to see how other variables have changed in that same location over those same years, whether we're talking the various ways of describing weather conditions, various ways of categorizing habitat conditions. We don't have a disturbance metric. Some of these things that we know influence where birds go, we don't have a long database to index that. Agricultural land use is another one of the variables that we're going to be looking at. And so we're getting closer to some of those questions, Andy, but it's still, I'll temper people's expectations. We're dealing with nature. It's complicated. Our data are imperfect. Our data are imperfect on every side of it, whether we're talking about band recovery distributions as a reliable indicator of where the birds actually are, or whether we're talking about our ability to accurately characterize the landscape using all these other data sets. So there's a lot of noise. It makes it frustrating from a scientist perspective. But again, it leaves us with some mystery and intrigue around these birds. And so we can be happy with that too.
So now we'll switch to everybody's favorite bird, the northern pintail. Down 11 from last year, down 49 long term. But still, so somebody put this in an interesting way. If you look at the number of pintails, it's right at 2 million. The year before it was 2.2. If you compare that to the gadwall or the American widgeon from 23, the American widgeon was estimated 1.8. Well, in 23, the pintail was 2.2. The American widgeon is not protected. You can shoot your bag limit of those. The pintail is.
That's right.
So now we're seeing what California is going to 3 next year.
Well, so I can say a few things here about harvest regulations. We don't wade off into that too far. I can tell you what I know because I've talked about this on some of our platforms previously. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of course, is the entity responsible for setting harvest regulations for migratory waterfowl here in the U.S. Canadian Wildlife Service does their own thing. States here in the U.S. have a say in the regulatory process through the flyway councils, but ultimately it goes to the Fish and Wildlife Service to make those decisions. That's legislatively mandated. What they did earlier this year, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service adopted a new interim pintail harvest strategy. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't just set harvest regulations willy-nilly. They work closely with the states to identify very clear objectives for a harvest strategy, what it is they're trying to accomplish, and then they look at a range of alternatives, and then they look at all the data that are available to help them make a wise decision about what is the sort of the allowable take from a given population relative to those objectives, relative to the expected harvest that would occur under different regulatory options, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of other things to cover there. So a lot of data, a lot of thought, a lot of modeling goes into all these different harvest regulation setting processes, some more than others. Pintail is certainly one of those where it has a lot of data and a lot of work going into it. They recently adopted a new interim pintail harvest strategy that will do the following things. Depending on the results from the breeding population survey, they will you'll have, well, really 4 options. One is a closed season. I think it's below 1.2 or 1.25. I forget exactly which, but there is a closure threshold. There is a point below which the optimal recommendation will be for the pintail season to be closed. There will also be there are 3 options for bag limits: one pintail bag limit, 2 pintail bag limit, and 3 pintail bag limit. Those are all based on the work that they've done in this model. And what the recommendation was from the Adaptive Harvest Management Report here recently was for a 3 pintail bag limit for the 25-26 season. Regulations are set a year in advance. And so that's what, it's not just, I'm saying all this just to point out, Andy, that it's not just California. All flyways, if things carry forward the way people expect them to, the decision is not final. There are a number of things that have to happen between now and next summer or fall before those regulations become final. But the proposal, based on the new interim pintail harvest strategy, is for a 3 pintail bag limit for all 4 flyways for the 25-26 season. That would be the first time since, I think, 1997 that duck hunters in the U.S. have had the option of a 3 pintail bag limit or anything higher than that.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone to such great lengths to protect the pintail, but I was talking, like I said earlier, like if you look at their numbers compared to the Widgeon or compared to the Gadwall, they're not that far off in the amount of numbers that's on this report. Gadwall's 2.2 this year. Pintail's, just a hair under 2 million, and we don't think anything about shooting 5 or 6 Gadwalls.
Yeah, that's starting to get off into the why of why can we shoot 6 Widgeon versus only 1 or 2 or 3 pintails, and that's really it's an area that I try to stay away from because our folks with the Fish and Wildlife Service and our state partners, they're much deeper into that data. They can tell you about the differences in the harvest, the harvest strategy, harvest objectives, the different types of data that are available for informing harvest regulations and how they differ and how harvest rates differ based on sort of historical observations. I think that's one of the big parts of it, is that we're using all our understanding of harvest rate for a given species in response to a certain bag limit for that species to inform this idea of, well, if we do this, what's going to be the likely harvest that results, and how will that harvest affect the population dynamics long term? All of that stuff is considered. A wealth of data goes into it. Just some of the smartest people I've ever met are involved in a lot of the modeling and analytical procedures associated with it. And it's also, there are different opinions on what our objective for harvest, waterfowl harvest, should be. It's anybody that's been around long enough will know that there are people that differ. Some people think we're shooting too many birds right now. Some people say, look, if we've been having liberal regulations for a quarter of a century and mallards are still doing well, they're still healthy. We got 6.6 million of them in the traditional survey area. They're okay with that. So it's an area that is there's no part of waterfowl management that has been more intensively studied and debated, honestly, than harvest regulations. And so it's fun to be part of those conversations, but I'm glad ultimately that we're not involved in those decisions.
I know it's not ducks, but I want to talk dove, and I know that's a little different, but it's still a migratory bird. I've never understood why. I know some states don't shoot dove, but the ones that do, we have tons of doves. A dove's lifespan, I think, is around 15 to 20 months. I don't know for sure, but I think that's pretty close. I don't understand why our dove season doesn't open September 1st and doesn't close January 31st, because a big majority of dove don't ever get hunted anyways or dying of old age. I don't think it would make any difference in the bird numbers if it was open for 4 months straight. I really don't, because we have a ton of dove here in January and February and March. They don't ever get hunted at all.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, Jeff, other than I like shooting doves. I like eating doves. It's been a while since I've been on a good dove shoot. But, that's another species for which our Fish and Wildlife Service and state partners collaborate on trying to figure out what is the most appropriate harvest strategy for those birds. They do population estimation methods. Mourning dove report comes out, and yeah, that's a species and harvest strategy about which I know even less than waterfowl. So, what I will say, if you guys don't mind, whenever you said migratory birds, it reminded me, Jeff and Andy, and this is very relevant because it's what dictates our ability to have harvest regulations or to have harvest hunting seasons for migratory birds in the first place. It's having access to reliable data. Migratory bird hunters may be aware of something known as the Harvest Information Program,
Yep.
HIP. There is, if you're on social media these days, you're probably going to see more outreach from your state agency or from other people on that you may know may be involved in this process or in this field, trying to educate people on the Harvest Information Program, what it is, who needs to get it, who doesn't need to get it. If you're a migratory bird hunter, whether a licensed migratory bird hunter, that being doves, rails, woodcock, snipe, waterfowl, cranes, you are required to get the HIP certifications where you answer those questions about, did you hunt migratory birds? Are you going to hunt migratory birds this year? Did you hunt migratory birds last year? And if so, how many did you harvest? If you are not going to hunt migratory birds, if you're just a squirrel hunter, rabbit hunter, deer hunter, turkey hunter, you do not need to get the HIP certification. I think there are a lot of people that have been getting the HIP certification when they didn't need to. There are a lot of people who have been maybe bypassing the questions that they're asked as part of that certification. But those questions are important. Those questions are not the basis for estimating actual harvest, but they are very important for assigning you to one of three different buckets from which the Fish and Wildlife Service will sample from. What they call the people that harvest very few birds, people that harvest sort of an average number of birds, and then people that harvest a lot of birds. It's what those answers, whenever you're getting HIP certification, that's what those answers are for. And even that is important to do correctly. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, unless y'all have other questions about the HIP certification, is if you hunt in multiple states, you have to get HIP certified for each of those states. And when you answer those questions at the checkout or online, you answer them relative to your hunting in that particular state the previous year. So I know the Harvest Information Program is something that is easily confused, and the Fish and Wildlife Service and state agencies and Ducks Unlimited is trying to help educate people so we can get better data from that very important set of surveys.
Yeah, I don't think anybody, does anybody take that seriously? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I think most people just put in numbers. Or I think a large portion of the people just put in numbers and then go proceed to check out.
I would not think it's very reliable, the number wise on it.
Well, again, the numbers are not being used to estimate harvest. They're used to assign you and then do sampling. So you're right. That's and you don't have to be exact. And that's why they use three different bins. I think it's less than 10 or something of that nature. Then it's 10 to 20 and then greater than 20. So if you can just approximate within those three, whatever the three bins are, then that goes a long way to developing a more reliable sampling frame from which the actual harvest estimates are then taken through subsequent surveys. You know, the diary survey and then the parts collection survey. That's where we actually get, Fish and Wildlife Service actually gets the harvest data.
I did not know that. I didn't know that they put you in like three separate categories and then we'll proceed from there.
And they harvest, or they sample at different rates, at least historically they did. And it's all based on statistical principles to try to get an accurate estimate with the greatest degree of precision. And you do that by trying to understand, who's the high harvest folks, the average harvest, and then the low harvest. And in theory, you would sample those groups at different frequencies. There wouldn't be as much of a need to sample the low harvest group as much because they're not accounting for the overall significant portion of the overall harvest. But you would want to sample the high harvest group at a higher frequency because that's where a lot of the harvest is occurring. And if you're wanting to accurately and precisely estimate harvest, that's where you need to be focusing your effort. So it's all rooted in fancy, exciting statistical principles.
Yeah. Well, I guess I need to do a better job of that, because I'm guilty of it whenever I see it. Most of the time, I am about to go dove hunting whenever I buy my license the first time, and I'm just trying to get it done. And I'll just pop in a couple numbers and walk on about my day. But I don't shoot that much. I mean, I guide 7 days a week, but I bet in 5 years I haven't gone through a case of shells. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I hunt a lot, but I don't shoot a lot. So I don't know.
Well, then, so then that's why they ask, how many birds did you harvest? So if you don't harvest a lot of birds, then you would be in that low harvest bucket. And then, you would still be eligible to get selected for completing either of those other surveys.
What's your opinion? Just your opinion. It's not scientific. Your opinion. Do you think that killing 3 pintails on the Pacific Flyway is going to make any difference in the numbers, really?
Or everywhere?
Or everywhere.
You're asking.
Just your opinion.
You're asking me to offer my opinion.
Yep.
Your gut instinct.
Your gut instinct, because so many percentage of ducks die regardless if it's disease, predator, or shooters. And I'm assuming that's why we're going to go to 3 pintails to see if it makes a difference. Do you think it's going to make any difference on the duck numbers? I personally don't think there's going to be much of a change with 3 or 1.
My gut instinct is that from a continental standpoint, now I think you will see the pintail harvest in California go up, because that's a state where you have a lot of pintails. During an average year, I think last year they had a tough year because of some strange weather conditions that they didn't get a lot of their birds migrating into the Central Valley until late into the season. But during a normal year, you should see pintail harvest go up in California. I would expect most people in California, it's winter. A lot of times those by December, January, you've got those fully plumed bull sprigs, and so you're going to have people taking those drakes. We've known for many years that duck populations are male biased in their sex ratio, and there are excess drakes in the population. Some of our harvest regulations are framed around that. There is no sex restriction in this new interim harvest strategy for pintails. I am not the right person to answer the why question on that, because that kind of all goes to our state and federal partners there. But I think you will see an increase in pintail harvest. I don't expect, and I say this because this is what our current understanding of harvest and population dynamics tells us. I don't expect this to have a dramatic effect on overall population size of pintails or the sustainability of the pintail population. However, the Fish and Wildlife Service and states have agreed as part of this interim strategy that after 3 years of experience with a 3 pintail bag limit, they're going to sort of reassess what using the latest and best available data to answer your exact question, Jeff. I mean, so I don't expect it to have a big effect on a population level. I mean, because we know ultimately what is the dominant driver of the ups and downs and long-term population levels for ducks is habitat conditions. That's it. And it always will be within the regulatory kind of frameworks that we have. A lot of people will say harvest doesn't matter. Well, harvest can matter. We've seen through variety of species that that harvest at some level can matter. So, but what we've seen over the years is that given the level of harvest that has occurred for the past however many decades, that is not what is driving the ups and downs of populations. And so that's the thing to just kind of add to that part of the conversation is harvest at the levels that we've seen in our lifetimes are not driving duck populations. There may be some years, some species for which they have a little bit of a bigger effect than others. Are we always able to measure that? Maybe, maybe not. But in the long term, it's habitat, and that's what's important. And that's why we and so many others are trying really, really hard to conserve the places that support and make more ducks. Mm-hmm.
So this will be a 3-year experiment, basically. So we can expect this 25, 26, and 27.
Not exactly. That's why the descriptions on this are really, really important. So for the 25-26 season, because of what they saw in the pintail breeding population numbers. You know how with mallard AHM, it's based on the mallard population size and the number of ponds. You've got that matrix that determines whether you're in a restrictive, moderate, or liberal season. For pintails, it's the breeding population size and the average latitude of settling for the pintail population. A lot of research has went into why that particular relationship is important, but those are the two different sort of axes of that matrix for the new pintail adaptive harvest management strategy. And given where the numbers fell this year, 1.975 million breeding pintails, and I don't know what the latitude was, but it was at a point where it recommended a 3 pintail limit for the 25-26 season. Now, it's possible, and so what the interim strategy says is that after 3 years of experience with a 3 pintail limit, they will reassess. There is no guarantee that in the 26-27 season or 27-28 season, we're going to have a 3 pintail limit. And so this is still interim until they get to that third year of a 3 pintail limit. So it could be 5 years, could be 8 years. They're going to be constantly looking at any and all of the data that come in from the new harvest regulations, from this harvest rate, bag limit, etc. But the way it's written is they're going to wait until after they get 3 years of experience with a 3 pintail limit. And be dictated by whatever they see during each of those years, so whether a 3 pintail limit is selected before they sort of reassess and figure out. Because ultimately, these decisions are all data driven. And that is one of the things that we can be thankful for. As long as we have our monitoring systems in place, whether it be for the breeding population survey, harvest surveys, band recovery program, those are the 3 pieces of data that are so important for helping us continue to manage waterfowl populations in North America better than any other group of migratory game on the planet. And we never stop asking the questions. That's the other thing that's important to remember. Just because these harvest plans and harvest management strategies are in place doesn't mean that we or our state or federal partners ever stop asking questions and try to figure out how to make it better.
Right. So I'm looking at the long term of the pintail, and in 55, it looks about like the first year, they topped out over 10 million breeding populations of the northern pintail, and then by 65 we see them down to 4 million. What changed in that? Was it agriculture? I mean, what caused that initial dip from 55 to 65?
Yeah, this is a pretty cool story. So there's been a lot of attention given to that 11 million number. A lot of people may say, perhaps that wasn't a true number. Folks that have gone back and looked at the survey data say, no, those data actually, it's kind of hard to misidentify a pintail, right? And so there are a lot of people that say, no, those are actual real numbers. What I can tell you is that over that time period from, let's say, the mid-50s through the 70s and into the 80s, there were some dramatic changes to the agricultural landscape, mainly of prairie Canada. And so I don't want to focus too much on the 11 million or 10 million or anything of that nature. That's not what's important. What is important is the decline that happened and brought us down to about the 3 million, 3.5 million average here in the past several decades. And that is some changes in agricultural practices across prairie Canada. Historically, what they used to do is about a third or a half of that landscape that was in agricultural production would have been left fallow every other year. Well, I guess half of it would have been left fallow every year. And so what happens is, and it was done for a number of reasons, and won't go into all of that, but what happened was when that ground was left fallow, they would leave it. Let me think about this here. It's been a while. I gave a presentation on this at our national convention. I want to make sure I get this right. So it would be it would be left fallow during one. Actually, let me think about this here. Think about after harvest think about the half of it that's planted to wheat during a given year. When it was harvested in summer, that stubble was left standing throughout winter and into the spring, and it was then left fallow into the summer. That's where I'm kind of thinking about this. So, and it was left fallow into the subsequent summer. So when pintails came back to the prairies in the spring, they would see that residual stubble as suitable nesting habitat. It had probably grown up in a few other weeds by then as well. And so they would nest it. So half of that prairie landscape that was an agricultural production was actually suitable nesting habitat. The other thing that happened is once you get to about midsummer, that fallow ground then becomes, which was in production the previous year, it gets plowed under. So that is what would be spring planted the previous year. I'm going into way too much detail on this than is necessary, not to do great a job of it. But the bottom line was that when they would, back in the 70s or so, when they came back to the Canadian prairies, there would be about half of the landscape that looked to be suitable nesting habitat, and about half of it was just dirt. And the dirt is what would have been fallow the previous year, would have been plowed under and prepped for planting the subsequent spring, and that's where you would plant into the spring. And so you didn't really have to worry about pintails nesting in dirt, right? They would nest in the fallow, and then the fallow would stay that way until midsummer, and by then they would have had time to pull off a brood. But then with increasing pressure to make a profit and other concerns, they went to continuous cropping year after year of spring planted winter wheat, largely winter wheat. And so, but they would leave the stubble standing after harvest. So when pintails come back in the spring, it all looks like suitable nesting habitat, but then it all gets planted as a result of the continuous cropping of spring wheat. And so you took tens of millions of acres of once sort of suitable nesting habitat, and it became spring planted, became in rotation every year. And there's some percentage of the nest that pintails will nest in that, but then the farmers and implements come along to plant during the spring, and they'll disturb those nests and set the pintails back. And so short version, Andy, is that it has been a fundamental and massive change in agricultural practices on the Canadian prairies that have made that landscape less attractive for pintails because of their propensity to nest in such short grass, and winter wheat stubble appears as short grass. They're one of the most other ducks don't nest in it as much as pintails. So that was a pretty rough explanation.
No,
I apologize for that. I should have been able to do that a little bit cleaner.
Are there any is there like a CRP program up in Canada that would be profitable enough for farmers to kind of raise their eyebrows at and maybe enlist their land into like a CRP program here for the pintails to nest in?
Not quite the way we have it here in the States. There have been a variety of things tried. What I can say from the pintail side of things, one thing that Ducks Unlimited invested in a number of years ago was trying to help develop better varieties of winter wheat. And so the idea there is that if we can produce a variety of wheat that is comparable in yield and quality to spring wheat and make it even marginally attractive to wheat farmers across the U.S. and Canadian prairies, such that a portion of their acreage goes into winter wheat, and by planting in the fall winter wheat, you don't disturb that. You don't disturb that crop until harvest time the following summer. And when pintails return to the prairies in the spring, they would see the short grass of that winter wheat, and it would remind them of the short grass prairie that they evolved to nest in. They would nest in it, and then they would have enough time to hatch their clutch of eggs before it was time to harvest. And so you wouldn't get that spring disturbance the way you do with spring planted wheat. And it works. We've demonstrated that from a duck standpoint, that works. Pintails will nest in it. Their nest success is higher. The problem is that the yield and the quality of the wheat is not as high as we need it to be to make it economically viable, economically competitive with spring wheat. And so we're still working on that. Others are still working on it. A lot of folks are working on it, not necessarily from a duck standpoint, but from an agricultural diversification standpoint. And I think there are a few other crops that may, fall planted rye also falls into that category. It's always been a duck friendly crop because you plant it in the fall and then it grows through winter, and then you don't harvest it until later in spring or summer. And you've had ducks have had an opportunity to successfully hatch a clutch of eggs. So a number of things like that. I think that probably has the greatest potential to have a landscape scale influence on a species like the pintail.
About how long, and I'm going to get trying to, excuse me, about how long after a clutch is hatched, how long until they can kind of get out of the way of the coming tractors? You know what I mean? How long? Dadgum, I'm struggling here.
24 hours.
24 hours.
Yeah, 24 hours. So when a hen will lay an egg, on average, pintail will lay about 9 eggs. She'll lay 1 egg a day. And once she gets that full clutch of eggs, she starts incubating. As she goes through that egg laying process, she gradually stays on the nest a little bit longer with each passing day, such that by the time she gets to egg number 9, let's say, she is spending 90% or so of her time on that nest incubating those eggs. Despite those eggs being laid, egg number 1 versus egg number 9 were laid 9 days apart, they will nevertheless hatch within 24 hours of one another, and sometimes a shorter length of time. And then once those eggs have hatched, she will keep the ducklings in the nest for less than 24 hours, at which time she will then lead them away from the nest into a wetland where they can start feeding on their own. Their young waterfowl are known as precocial, which means whenever they hatch, their eyes are open, they're covered in down, and they can move on their own, and they can also feed on their own. That's different from your average backyard songbirds, which are altricial, and meaning that their eyes are closed, they're not fully feathered, they actually have no feathers on them, they can't feed themselves, obviously can't get out of the nest. So it's just different sort of strategies. The incubation period for waterfowl is longer than it is for songbirds. And so it's a trade-off, right? You spend more time incubating, but then once you hatch, you're ready to go. And so they will hit the wetland within 24 hours of hatching.
Right. So she's got to find, in theory, and it's just the dumb version of it, she's got to find a wheat field or a suitable field that's close to water that she can get her clutch to the water within 24 hours.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's kind of this. It's got to be a perfect scenario for her to want to lay eggs in.
It's tough. So that's right. You got to have two things. You have to have nesting cover, and you also have to have a wetland within a decent distance. And decent distance could be a half mile, could be a mile. Ideally, you want multiple wetlands of different types. You want those wetlands to be to have water long enough for those birds to fledge, while those real shallow seasonal wetlands are some of the first to thaw and will provide that initial flush of invertebrates for the female to kind of top off her nutrients on once she first gets back. You have to have semi-permanent wetlands or otherwise additional rainfall to keep those wetlands full, or at least have some water in them long enough for ducklings to survive and fledge. And so that's why we need a lot of grasslands. We need a lot of wetlands of a lot of different types. And typically it requires some precipitation to keep some of those wetlands full throughout that season. That's also one of the reasons why early nesting birds typically do better, like on a species by species within a given species. Earlier nesting birds typically do better because, especially for pintails and mallards, because as you get farther into summer, the chances of a wetland drying up are going to be higher and higher.
Right.
So the early duck gets the better wetland, I guess you could say.
So my last question, and we'll start wrapping up here because I know you're a busy man. Was there anything on this survey that kind of made you raise your eyebrows or a red flag for any species of duck or just anything in general that kind of made you go, oh, I'm uneasy about the numbers that we saw?
Not really. I think this was fairly consistent with what I was expecting, to be honest. The one thing that I think concerns me, and this doesn't show up in the numbers, but this shows up a lot of times when you read the reports from the pilot biologist, and that's how they remark about the continued conversion and drainage of wetlands in various landscapes throughout the prairies, the additional conversion of native grasslands to agricultural production in some of those landscapes. Those things are ongoing concerns, and the fact that pilots that have been doing this for 10 or 20 years remark on how the landscape has changed, that's what concerns me. We've lost CRP from in considerable acreage from the Dakotas. That's concerning. We know that CRP can be tremendously valuable nesting habitat for ducks. That's the big concern, Andy and Jeff, is the continued loss of the capacity of the prairies to support duck populations. We can still be optimistic and talk about how ducks are resilient, and once the prairies get wet again, the ducks are going to respond. But at some point that kind of catches up with us, and at some point there's a new normal, even under those wet prairie conditions. It takes a long time for us to kind of figure out when we've gotten there, but I can tell you we're getting closer with each passing year where we lose more grass, we lose more wetlands. It's simple math. The capacity of that landscape to support ducks decreases. Now, we still have that big boreal forest to serve as a safety net, but the wetlands typically are not as productive. They typically do not support as many ducklings or pairs per wetland as we see on the prairies. It's just not as productive from a nutritional standpoint or from a duck production standpoint. But we have to keep it intact as well because it is massive, and it will continue to support ducks. But if we lost the prairies, you would see population levels at or below where we are right now. And remember, for many species, we are at or below our long-term average. The importance of the prairies is not debatable. We can see it in the data for any species you look at that relies on that landscape. And so this was an important reminder, I think, of that, and that when it's still functioning, the prairie still functions, but the observations from the pilots tell us that things are not things are moving, continuing to move in a direction that threatens the future capacity of that landscape. But I was happy to see that we didn't fall again this year. I was happy to see, and we haven't even really talked about this, a lot of rain fell right as they were about to start the survey. If it had not been for that rain that fell in what would have been in April and May, and that continued into June, but if it had not been for that rain that fell like the 2 or 3 weeks prior to this survey being conducted, I think we would have had much lower numbers on the wetland side of things. The one thing that I'll point out, and this, again, emphasizes the importance of conserving habitats across that broad prairie landscape. The habitat conditions were dramatically different between the Canadian side and the U.S. side. On the U.S. side, I think it was about 50% above average in terms of the total pond count, which I believe was the highest pond count in 10 years on the U.S. side. On the Canadian side, I think it was, let me actually get this right here. On the Canadian side, they were 24% below average for the pond count. And it was the lowest pond count in 20 years. So highest in 10 in the States and lowest in 20 in Canada. And that shows you the dynamic nature of that landscape and why it's important for us to have habitats conserved across all of the prairies. It's why it's our number one priority on both sides of the border. And what we need now is some more rainfall across that area as we head into fall and winter. We need some good winter snow, and then we need some rain across the prairies next spring as well. And if that happens, then we can probably get a little bit excited about what we might see next fall, but we're still a long way from that.
Yeah, we were talking to somebody, it might have been David, and he was skeptical that the rain might have been too late. Maybe it was too early. I can't remember. But he was worried that the timing might have been off to impact it too much.
Well, so he is right. It did come a little bit late. It came late from a duck standpoint because what happened was that we had an early spring. It was a warm spring. A lot of the species like mallards and pintails and some of the early migrants, they migrated through to the prairies at a time when that landscape was still pretty dry. And so they migrated on through. Some of them settled. It wasn't totally dry, but some of them settled. But a lot of them went on north into the boreal forest. And that's the other thing that the numbers showed us this year. Numbers in the boreal forest were up substantially. Duck numbers in the prairies were down substantially. And that reflects the fact that a lot of these birds migrated through at a time when it was still dry. But then the rains came. And so it was totally a matter of the timing of this rain. The timing of that rain boosted the prairie, the pond count, which is helpful and important from a harvest regulation standpoint. And it's also helpful from the standpoint of those birds that did settle in the prairies. It's helpful from the standpoint of later nesting species like gadwall and blue wings. And it's important from the perspective of renesting species or renest opportunities and brood survival for those birds that settled in the prairies. And so all that was a great thing. David is exactly right. It came late to benefit the early migrants, and a lot of those birds went on to the boreal forest, but it still was a very welcome development, and I suspect it's going to produce some young ducks out of the prairies. I know it will. I already heard from some friends up there shooting some blue wings, and he said most of what he has shot are young birds. So yeah, we know there's been some production, and that's probably going to be the case across much of that landscape. They got some water. So for those birds that were there, it's good. But we did not have the lion's share of the population settle in that landscape this year.
We got teal season next week, so it's going to be interesting. So we finally got water.
We got teal behind the lodge. I just saw them.
Oh, do we?
Just now.
Perfect.
They showed up.
They just showed up.
Hey, that's when does it open this weekend for y'all?
No.
Yes. No. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 10 days.
Yeah.
2 weeks.
12 days or whatever.
It's one of those. Yeah, one of those things where you're going to get some of that cooler, pretty strong cold front, I guess, here this coming weekend. And I'm sure you'll lose some teal. You'll probably pick up a lot more, though. So hopefully it'll be around for you once your season opens.
It's always a fun time. Listen, this has been a lot of fun. Keep up the good work out there. And when you see Jimbo today, give him a slap upside the head or something for me. It's always
okay.
It's always great talking to you guys at Ducks Unlimited. And have a safe season this year.
Thanks, Andy and Jeff. You guys, same to you as well. I always enjoy getting on talking with you. Everybody loves to talk about ducks. Happy to do it anytime.
Thank you so much.
God bless you and have a great week, my friend.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Interesting guy.
Dr. Mike Brasher breaking down what we saw on the duck number report. Came out a couple weeks ago. So there you go.
It's
3 pintails.
It's crazy because I'm all for everything we can do to build more ducks. But you put a smelt in a river in California, and I'm like, just don't go without to help that damn smelt.
Right.
It's crazy what we prioritize in our lives.
Everybody's that way.
Yep. Thank y'all for listening. I hope everybody had a great opener, whether you were shooting doves, whether you're in Canada or you're shooting big geese in America somewhere. Be safe. Take your kid hunting. And please, please, please vote and get 3 of your friends to vote. Thank you and God bless you.
Love you. Bye. Watch for deer. Check out all of our great sponsors. Go figure out a way to get involved with Ducks Unlimited. They're doing great work. Double T British Kennels, Mossberg, Mallard Bay, Stanfield Outfitters, Alpha Outdoor Specialties, Hemp Hill Farm. Use our promo code BHP. I already did Mallard Bay. MLR Graphics, Boss Shot Shells, Pacific Calls, BHP25 is a promo code there. Dive Bomb Industry, Dirty Duck Coffee, Shin Gear, Looking Glass Podcast, Lucky Duck, and Mitch Hall Chevrolet.